The Cleveland Torso Murderer. Cleveland, 1933, the city that forgot its dead. Cleveland in 1933 was not a city so much as it was a wound that refused to heal. The wind off Lake Erie carried the kind of cold that slipped beneath your coat and into your bones, a damp, persistent chill that no amount of whiskey could quite drive away. Factories stood like skeletons along the riverbanks, their smokestacks blackened and lifeless, towering monuments to a prosperity that had vanished overnight. The streets were filled with men who had once built things with their hands and now had nothing left but those same hands shoved deep into empty pockets. Women kept their faces down, their coats pulled tight, their children walking too quietly beside them, as if hunger itself had taught them to tiptoe. That winter, Cleveland did not dream. It merely endured. I had been a detective in this city long enough to remember when people believed in it, when they believed in work and wages and the promise that tomorrow might look better than today. By 1933, that belief had rotted away like cheap wood left to the rain. All that remained was survival. And survival, I learned, has a way of sanding down a man's soul until there is very little left worth polishing. My name used to matter. It was spoken with respect once, in hallways that smelled of ink and ambition, in smoky back rooms where informants whispered secrets for the price of a drink, in courtrooms where men with blood on their hands pretended to be innocent and looked straight at me when their lies collapsed beneath the weight of evidence. Now, most people did not remember it at all, and those who did remembered it wrong. I was the drunk one, the washed-up one, the bastard who couldn't let go. They were not entirely wrong. I lived above a closed bar on Euclid Avenue, in a narrow room that smelled of old wood and failure. The bar's sign still hung outside, its paint peeling and the letters barely clinging to the frame, as if the building itself were too tired to bother falling down. The owner had fled west 2 years earlier with the cash he could scrape together, and the place had been rotting in silence ever since. It suited me. Silence, and I had made a kind of peace with each other. Most mornings, I woke up before the cold did. My knees ached in the way that only comes from old injuries and older regrets. My head carried the dull throb of a man who pretended that alcohol still worked the way it once had. I'd sit on the edge of my bed until the room stopped spinning, listening to the city breathe, the distant rumble of freight cars, the cough of a man somewhere below me, the lonely wail of a river that had seen better days. Then I would dress carefully, like a man preparing for something important, even though nothing important waited for me anymore. Until the bodies started turning up. They rarely send someone like me a formal invitation back into the world. No knock on the door. No badge resurrected from the dead. Instead, Cleveland did what it always did. It whispered. The first I heard of it was in a soup line. A man with eyes too large for his skull leaned close as we waited for our ladle of steam and salt. His breath smelled like desperation and cabbage. They found another, he said. Another what? I asked. He glanced around as if death might be listening. One of the river ones. That was how it started. Not with headlines. Not with outrage. With a phrase. The river ones. Within a week, the newspapers caught up. The Cleveland Community Press printed a small column on page 4. No photograph, no real detail, just a polite, uncomfortable shape of a story. A body near Kingsbury Run. Identified. No. Cause of death? Undetermined. Authorities investigating. Authorities. That word used to mean something to me. Then there came another. And another. Always along the river. In the rail yards. In the forgotten places where the city's unwanted collected like dust. Men without homes. Women without families. Names that didn't matter to anyone else. But they mattered to me. They mattered because when you've spent enough years hunting monsters, you begin to understand one thing very well. Monsters do not hunt the powerful. They hunt the invisible. I told myself I wouldn't get involved. God knows I tried. But when your whole life has been shaped by locked doors and unanswered screams, you don't simply stop hearing them. You pretend, maybe. You drink. You rot. But deep down, something in you stays awake. And that something stirred the night I saw her. She sat at the far end of the diner on Superior Avenue, the kind of place that served gray eggs and coffee that tasted like burned hope. I hadn't noticed her at first. Women in Cleveland had mastered a certain art by then, the art of vanishing in plain sight. But she was crying. Not loudly. Carefully. The kind of crying that tries very hard not to exist. I didn't know why I walked over to her. Old habit, maybe. Or maybe the dead had followed me in through the door. Are you lost? I asked. She looked up and saw what everyone else saw. A man who had outlived his usefulness. Her voice was thin as winter light. My sister hasn't come home. That was all she said. But it was enough. I knew that sentence. Knew the way it tasted. Knew the shadow it dragged behind it. I sat down. What's her name? I asked. And just like that, Cleveland opened its mouth and began to speak. Hay brought me the photographs first. Glossy, tremulous squares of light and shadow that tried to tell stories they had no right to tell. The young lieutenant slid them across the desk as if he were passing a live coal. His fingers trembled where he touched the paper, not from cold, but from the kind of nausea that comes when a man is asked to look too long at something he cannot unsee. You shouldn't be looking at this, he said. It was not a warning to me. It was a warning to himself. I looked anyway. The images were sterile and clinical. An outline of a body where a man once had been. A sheet pulled aside to show the city's neglect. No close-ups. Nothing sensational. The department had learned to be careful after the papers made a spectacle of the first ones. Even so, there was a cruelty in the way the photographs reduced people to shapes on a page. They're coming from Kingsbury Run, the lieutenant said. Another 3 found yesterday morning. We've got 2 males, 1 female. Identifications, not promising. That single word, promising, was a bureaucrat's cloth to hide an ugly wound. In the reports, the men were transients. The woman was unidentified. In one line in a ledger, their lives ended with neat, indifferent strokes. I had seen that ledger before. I knew the author of such lines. A system built to manage inconvenience rather than grief. You want me to look? I asked. His laugh was bitter. We can't stop you. But you're not on the case. There it was. The polite refusal. The departmental shrug. They'd stowed me away in a corner long enough to make me think I wasn't still hungry for a chase. If hunger is a thing that can be taught, then the department hoped I was finished learning. I went to Kingsbury Run anyway. If you have never been to a place like that, imagine the city's underside made tactile. Tents patched together from newspaper and burlap. Fires and rusted oil drums puffing smoke like old men coughing. People keeping their backs turned to the world because turning is a waste of heat. Kingsbury Run was not one location so much as it was a gathering place for the expelled. The men and women the city decided it could not afford to keep warm. I walked the run with my coat collar up and my hands in my pockets. People watched, as they always watched, the way those who know they are being observed do, not with surprise, but with a careful, practiced indifference. They saw my face, and they guessed my story. They were usually right. The coroner met me there, a thin man with a cigarette that never seemed to reach its end. He greeted me by name as if I had a title he respected long ago and kept out of habit. You're not supposed to be here, he said. Neither are you, I replied. He smiled without warmth. People like you and I don't get a lot of say in where we end up on a Tuesday morning. We stepped aside from the nearest cluster. The coroner pointed, discreetly, to where the blankets had been folded back. He did not drag me to the site. I had seen enough in my life to know the thing itself would tell me nothing different than the coroner's face already had. There's patterns, he said. Not the kind you see with the eye so much as the kind you read between the lines. Timing. Place. The way the river throws them out like an afterthought. He spoke as a man who had seen the same shape repeated until the shape had become a kind of grammar. The coroner had a softness to his voice that made the details worse, because he didn't relish them. He catalogued them like a man who was exhausted by the counting. Any leads? I asked. He shook his head. No IDs. No witnesses who saw anything other than a figure in the night. No prints. God knows the run eats a man's tracks the way the river eats driftwood. I thought of the first woman I had seen crying that morning in the diner. I thought of the names she must have been carrying in the pocket of her ribs. The coroner cleared his throat and handed me a small slip of paper with scribbled notes. Measurements, times, a list of items found with the bodies, a scrap of coat, the burned corner of a photograph, the dull glint of a ring without a stone. These people had lives, I said. They weren't simply bodies to be catalogued. The coroner looked at me then, and there was something like pity in his eyes. Lives are harder to prove than death, he said. I visited the nearest lodging houses and soup kitchens in the days that followed. I asked the questions a good detective asks not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. Who had been seen? who had argued, who had gone missing. I spoke with men whose faces were rationed by the seasons, and with women who had the practiced blindness of those forced to surrender details for the sake of safety. The answers were a quilt of small griefs stitched together by poverty. At the boarding house on the east side, a thin man with nicotine-stained fingers remembered a name, Quinn Avery. Used to sing when he was sober, the man said, peering into the distance as if he could summon the voice. Sang for the streetcars. Could charm a coin out of a miser's pocket. Then the mills shut and the tune stopped. At a storefront where a woman distributed bread, a single scrap of paper was handed to me, a letter, folded 3 times and written in a hand that trembled. It was not a name. It was a plea. If you see my Rosa, tell her to come home, it read. Tell her the baby is sick and I can't do this alone. That tiny plea hit me in a place I thought I had sealed off years ago. Who were these people when they were not defined by lack? They were fathers, sons, daughters, women who had loved someone and been loved back. They were pots of stew shared by trembling hands, arguments about who would try to find work, lullabies hummed in the dark. They were the kind of ordinary things newspapers never printed because ordinary things did not make for sensational headlines. Which is exactly why the story died so quickly in public. The editors of the morning papers had decided their readers preferred scandal to sorrow. A politician's slurred speech drew more ink than the slow, grinding extinction of human beings on the margins. The city had priorities, and priorities were what allowed certain miseries to be sanitized and others to be ignored. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere had hardened into a protective scab. Younger detectives avoided the run. Promotions had a way of moving men away from the unpleasant. Ambition is a useful anesthetic. When I pressed a captain about whether the department would assign more resources, he looked at me with a look I had learned to dread. The look of a man calculating the political cost of caring. You're poking at something that's going to make a mess, he said. Messes cost votes. When I began asking about the men the city had lost, he shrugged and turned away. His indifference was not born of cruelty alone. It was born out of calculation. To expend effort on the invisible, courted trouble. Trouble might reveal failures, and failures might have names people in office preferred not to remember. But the more I asked, the more small things began to surface in that grainy way such things do. A ledger with a column for unclaimed bodies. A memo from a sanitation official mentioning an unusual number of corpses found near the rail yards. A rumor of a brazen businessman who had the ear of the mayor and a habit of quietly asking for certain undesirables to be left alone. I learned 2 things then that ate at my sleep. 1, these were not isolated tragedies, but a trend, a rhythm woven into a city that had decided certain lives were expendable. 2, the fewer hands that cared, the easier it was for those who wanted to keep their secrets to keep them. I began to sleep with the light on. Not because I feared the dark, but because the dark contained the voices of the run, soft and insistent. In the small hours, I would write names into a notebook. Quinn Avery, Rosa Delaney, Thomas O'Reilly. Beside each name, I wrote the scrap of life I had uncovered. A song, a letter, a memory of a laugh. It was a crude way to take back the anonymity the city had thrust upon them. When I left the precinct the night I found the ring in the dirt, I walked down to the river and watched the black water drift by. It seemed obscene to stand there and not feel anything. But grief, over time, becomes a kind of muscle. It flexes differently the longer you carry it. You following something, old man? A voice called from the shadows. It was Burke, a patrolman who had once been my informant and now my reluctant ally. He was younger than me by a decade, neat in his uniform, his cap at the precise angle that said he still believed a badge meant something. You been reading the papers? I asked. He shrugged. Somebody's got to. But they don't publish what matters. They only print what sells. Quiet bodies don't move ink. You been talking to people? I asked. He nodded. A little. The men on the run talk when they think you won't listen. You want to know who's missing? You ask them what they remember about the last time someone was drunk and singing. And what do they remember? Burke looked at the river as if the current could answer better than either of us. They remember lights on barges at night. Trucks running late. Men in suits who don't look like they belong in this part of town. They remember the sound of a fight that was hurried away, like someone sweeping dirt under a floorboard. There it was again, the sweep of hands hiding something that refused to stay hidden. I felt the old hunger sharpen into something with teeth. "You'll get in trouble," Burke said softly. "Well," I replied, and the sentence lacked the bravado it once might have contained. "I'm already in it." When I walked away from the river that night, the notebook weighed heavier in my pocket than any lead I had carried in years. The city slept poorly, and I moved through streets where people pretended not to notice the violence in the margins. The ones no one claimed had a way of finding you if you were willing to let them. I was willing, and I could not, let them be swallowed without saying their names. By the time I reached my room over the closed bar, the lines between my past and the case were already blurring. The faces of the run's dead slipped into my dreams, and I woke with the residue of their last breaths sticking to my throat. The department had not reassigned the case. Officially, nothing had changed. Unofficially, something dangerous had begun. The city that looked away. By the third week, the city had decided it was tired of noticing. That may sound strange, but cities grow exhausted much the same way people do. They don't shut down all at once. They sag. They avert their eyes. They learn the careful art of walking past what hurts because acknowledging it would demand something in return. Cleveland perfected that art in 33. The murders did not stop. They merely stopped being news. In my notebook, the list of names grew heavier than any headline ever could. The paper smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and cheap ink, and when I flipped its pages in the small hours of the night, the sound was like dry leaves in a graveyard. Sometimes I dreamed that the names rearranged themselves when I slept, crawling across the margins like insects searching for warmth. Each name had a voice now, not in the way men talk about ghosts, no rattling chains or melodrama. These voices were worse than that. They were ordinary. They spoke of shoes that no longer fit, of soup that tasted watered down, of hands that used to work steel and now shook when they tried to hold a match. The city did not want their stories. It wanted quiet. The fourth body of the week, or fifth, depending on whose count you believed, was found near an abandoned freight yard south of the river. The papers called it another unfortunate discovery and devoted more space to the mayor's luncheon speech than they did to the dead. A grainy photograph ran on the back page, a stretch of dirty ground blurred with shadow, a sheet lumped into an anonymous outline. No name, no past, just an inconvenience. Inside the precinct, irritation replaced alarm. The young officers whispered in stairwells like schoolboys with secrets they wished they didn't have. The older ones grew hard with the quiet resentment of men who knew they were being asked to care about people the city had already grieved away. I knocked on doors few others wanted to touch. I spoke to a railway clerk with a limp earned in an accident nobody had paid for. He remembered a woman with a scarf the color of dried roses who used to bring him coffee when he worked late. "She stopped coming around," he said. "Just like that. Didn't say goodbye. Nobody ever does down here, you know. Hellos cost too much." At a dockside flop house, a former dock worker named Archie told me about a man who carried a silver harmonica and played it with the confidence of someone who had once been loved. He used to sit by the water and make the river sound gentle, Archie said, like it could be a good thing. When I asked if anyone had last seen the man by the rail yards, Archie stared at my collar as if it might deliver a verdict. "Life don't end clean for people like us," he said. "It just fades, like smoke. You ever try chasing smoke?" I had, and I had learned it stains your hands. The city council announced a task force with the enthusiasm of men naming a new park bench. The press dutifully printed the phrase in bold and then promptly lost interest. The task force had no office, no budget, and no clear leader. It existed almost entirely as an abstract promise, the kind you hang on a wall and admire without ever meaning to use. I pressed Captain Wilkes again. He frowned like a man who could not decide whether I was an inconvenience or an embarrassment. "You're not helping yourself," he said. "I'm not trying to," I replied. "I'm trying to help them." He gestured vaguely, as though the word them offended him. "You think you're the only one who knows it's bad out there," he snapped. "This whole damn town is bad. You don't stabilize a river by diving into it. What do you do?" I asked. "You build on higher ground," he said. There it was again, the doctrine of distance. Keep yourself safe by standing where the flood can't reach you. Let the others learn to swim. Or sink. I began to understand the shape of the thing we were up against not as a killer, but as a climate. Cleveland itself had grown teeth. What haunted me most was not the crimes, it was their ease. No struggle loud enough to be remembered. No witness brave enough to matter. Just the quiet removal of people whose absence did not tear a hole in the city large enough to be seen. I walked into a bar beneath one of the bridges late one night and ordered whiskey not because I needed it, but because I wanted an excuse to stand there. Bars are confessionals for the damned. Give men enough darkness and enough drink, and they become poets of their own undoing. A young woman with eyes too steady for her age sat beside me. She wore a coat that didn't belong to her, its sleeves too long, as though she had borrowed comfort from a taller ghost. "You a cop?" she asked. "No. You look like one," she said. "That's unfortunate." She smiled thinly. "For both of us." I bought her a drink she didn't finish, and when she spoke again, it was without preamble. "They pick from the edges," she said. "You know that. The ones who don't have people to ask where they went." "You ever seen anything?" I asked. She tapped ash into a glass and stared at it, as though it might organize itself into a truth. "Seen men get into cars with other men who look important," she said. "Suits. Polite hands. Voices that sound like money even when you can't hear them. And then the seats are empty the next night. License plates." I asked. She laughed, not sweetly. "You think cars like that have plates?" I did not. But I thought of Burke's barges. Trucks running late. Workers where workers should not be. "What keeps you here?" I asked her. Her eyes moved from mine to the empty bar and back like a clock that had forgotten how to tell time. "This city is a husk," she said. "But it's my husk. There are no maps for the way something becomes yours simply because it hurts you last and hardest." Outside, the river slid past with the indifference of something that has watched too much to be impressed anymore. When I returned to my room that night, I found my notebook open on the table. I was certain I had closed it. At first I thought it was a trick of memory, the kind of misjudgment a tired man makes easily. But then I noticed the new entry on the last page. No name, no time, just a line written in a hand that did not belong to me. "Stop digging." I stood there for an hour with the paper trembling between my fingers. When you have lived a long time, you come to recognize true warnings not by their words, but by what they promise to take from you. Fear isn't loud. It is specific. I burned the page in the sink and watched the ash corkscrew into nothing. My building creaked and sighed around me, an old man settling his bones. Somewhere in the distance, a freight train sang to itself, and the sound pulled at something raw inside me. Someone knew. Not only that, someone cared enough to be watching. That gave the whole thing a pulse. I went to Burke the next day and didn't bother with pleasantries. "They're paying attention," I told him. "And they want me still." He looked at me for a long, careful moment. "Then you're not just walking into weather," he said. "You're walking into a man." "What kind of man?" I asked. Burke's mouth tightened. "The kind who doesn't bleed where people can see it." When I left him, it was with the knowledge that I had crossed from curiosity into collision. Whatever moved in the city's shadow was no longer content to let me wander unseen. The river had noticed me. And rivers, once they decide to rise, do not do so politely. All the king's men. Power doesn't announce itself. It leaks. Like gas from a bad pipe, invisible and poisonous. It slips into every room until people forget what clean air smells like. Cleveland in those days didn't look corrupt so much as it looked organized, and that was how the rot convinced the city it was healthy. The names began to circle back to one man. Not loudly, not officially, like a rumor that had learned how to walk. Elijah Eli Mercer. He owned rail contracts, had interests in scrap yards, held stakes in shipping companies that moved freight up and down the lake like a heartbeat. In the papers, he was an industrialist, a benefactor, a civic cornerstone. His photograph showed a soft jaw and gentle eyes set above a smile that suggested a man who never found anything surprising anymore. The irony did not escape me. Men who are surprised by nothing are usually guilty of something. I found his name cross-played through enough civilian conversations to feel it vibrating beneath the city's skin. Not as an accusation, not as evidence, as gravity. Where things vanished, Mercer's business seemed to endure. Where permits were issued, his signature loitered in the margins. Where unions softened, his generosity had preceded them. He was the sort of man who never shouted, but was always obeyed. I did not go to him directly. Men like Mercer had doors designed to make you feel small. I went instead to a woman who cleaned them. Mrs. Whitaker had been employed at Mercer's Lakeside Avenue residence since before the stock market decided to collapse the world. She lived in a thin brick house that smelled of boiled starch and old prayer. Her hands were strong, scarred by knives and cold water. When I knocked, she opened the door as if she'd expected the knock all her life. "I'm not here to trouble you," I said. "That's what trouble always says," she replied. I showed her my notebook. Not the names, not yet, but the ring, the scrap of cloth, the kind of things that moved slowly enough to feel like accidents. "I'm trying to find people," I said. Mrs. Whitaker studied the ring with a face that had learned not to give up secrets unless they asked politely. "Then you best be looking in places that don't want to be found," she said. "My employer is not one of those places." "Then why do I hear his name whenever something disappears?" I asked. Her eyes turned to the window, to a view that did not deserve the name. "Because rich men don't vanish," she said. They rearranged the room. I was left with nothing more than a phrase and a closed door. But phrases can be sharper than knives. I spoke with union organizers who had learned to wear disappointment like a second jacket. They told me about sudden donations and men who changed sides with the weather. I talked to a city clerk who smelled of ink and nerves. He let slip that Mercer's company permits were processed with extraordinary efficiency. Extraordinary. An innocent word. A crooked profession. Burke grew quieter. He did not avoid me. He stayed too long when we met. A man who wants to leave you alone does so with speed. Burke lingered, and that was how I knew he was scared. "You're stepping into rooms that don't like echoes," he warned. "I've never liked rooms that pretend they're empty," I told him. One night, a car followed me from Public Square all the way to East 79th Street without trying to hide it. I let it. Fear loses its teeth the moment you invite it to walk beside you. At the third intersection, the car slowed just enough for a message to drift across the asphalt and into my lungs. "You are inches from consequences." It did not feel like a threat. It felt like a diagnosis. And diagnoses are rarely given in time to cure anything. The next day, the task force was dissolved with a polite announcement and even politer applause at City Hall. No one protested. The newspapers called it a refocusing of resources. In Cleveland, the dead were not resources. They were obstacles. I knew then that this was no longer about solving anything. This was about being watched fail. At Mercer's annual charity gala, a thing made of silk and smiles, I watched him in person for the first time. His laughter sounded practiced, but convincing. Women leaned in like flowers toward a false sun. Politicians gathered in his orbit like prayers. He stood like a man wearing the city as a coat. I did not speak to him. It was enough to watch his hands remain clean while lesser men dirted theirs for him. Power is best observed as a ripple, not a wave. You follow what moves around it. Near midnight, I found myself alone in the service corridor with a waiter who did not have the face of a waiter. "Don't," he said without looking at me. "Don't what?" I asked. "Try," he said. "You won't like what you unscrew." "I never do," I replied. He shook his head and hurried away as if I were a responsibility he did not want named. Later that week, a building burned in the flats. Accident, the fire chief said, his lips still warm from somebody else's glass. The building had been scheduled for demolition. The men who had been sleeping there had not been scheduled for anything. When Burke arrived at my room that night, his face was older than it had been in the morning. "They're closing ranks," he said. "People are being warned, not in words, but in adjustments. Jobs disappear. Charges settle. Windows open by themselves." "Tell me one thing," I said. "Just one." Burke looked at the floor like it had offended him. "Mercer paid for a new section of the city morgue in 31, he said. Brand new refrigeration unit. State of the art. Nobody remembers who suggested it. Only that the money arrived before the request did. A man who paid for cold. Not medicine. Not food. Cold. I imagine Mercer standing in an immaculate suit, writing checks with the confidence of someone funding a long-term project. A man does not invest in refrigeration unless he expects there will be things to store. When I stepped into the morgue the next morning, the walls felt different. Colder. Grateful. I wasn't allowed inside the new unit. But the old one still had stories. I leaned close enough to feel their breath. What I learned there I did not write down. Some things, once named, grow legs. When I left, I did so with the knowledge that the file would never close and the truth would never be introduced properly. It had no respectable outfit to wear. It was naked and shivering and without a party affiliation. That evening, as if summoned by the sheer weight of intention, a letter arrived at my door. No stamp. No sender. It contained only an address and a time. Tomorrow, 9 o'clock, down by the river. I did not feel brave. I felt expected. Power never begs. It summons. And the city waited like a courtroom with no jury in sight. The river knows your name. The river did not sleep. It merely pretended. At night, the water moving past Cleveland gave the illusion of rest. A soft slipping sound, a languid black shimmer under crooked lamps. But I knew better. Rivers remember. They record each footstep, each secret, each body lowered or lifted again by indifferent hands. By 9 o'clock the next evening, the shoreline had hollowed itself into a cathedral of shadow. The address led me to an old freight dock just south of the abandoned mills. No lights, no guard booths, nothing official. The kind of place that once had purpose and now had only memory. I arrived early, not out of caution, out of disrespect for anyone who thought they could control time. The wind off Lake Erie cut through me like a thin blade. I stood with my coat drawn tight and my breath steaming, listening. Somewhere downstream, a barge's horn sighed like a tired god. The city's noise thinned and finally broke away, leaving only water and night. At exactly 9, a car arrived. No headlights. No show. It rolled close enough that its engine whispered to my boots and stopped. A man got out. Not Mercer. Older. Tall. A face built for funerals. "You came," he said. "I was invited," I replied. He nodded once and gestured toward the water. "My employer appreciates punctuality." "Then your employer should carry a watch and meet me himself," I said. The man's mouth curved almost imperceptibly. "He already has." It took me a second too long to understand. Then I looked down. At my feet, stenciled faintly into the dock in chalk, so pale it might have been breath, was my name. My real name. Not the one the department knew. Not the one a city would use. The one my mother had whispered. White letters dissolving into damp wood. "You've been busy," I said. "Longer than you think," he replied. The river shifted. It made a sound like something listening. "You're walking a narrow bridge," the man said, producing a cigarette he did not light. "Below you is a city that does not need you alive to succeed." "So it does need me dead?" I asked. "No," he said calmly. "It does not need you at all." That, oddly, stung the most. We stood there in parallel silence, two old wars not ready to surrender. "You think you're unprecedented," he said at last. "That no one has tried to rearrange the furniture you're tripping over. But this city is older than your sense of justice. It learned long ago how to grow new walls when it doesn't like a window. You're not here to negotiate," I said. "You're right," he replied. "Then why am I standing here?" I asked. He flicked his cigarette into the river without lighting it. The dark water swallowed it without sound. "You're here to be informed," he said. "Not threatened. Not bribed. Merely explained to." "And the explanation is?" I waited. "You are not the kind of man this story ends well for." We stared at each other then, and in the quiet I felt something old return to me. Not courage, exactly, but inertia. Once a man begins moving in a certain direction, stopping feels like a betrayal of gravity. "Tell Mercer," I said, "that a man who builds cold rooms for bodies should start worrying about where his own will rest." For the first time, the man reacted. Not in fear. In interest. He studied me like a curious specimen. Then he nodded and walked away. The car vanished without ceremony. I was left with my name and the river that knew it. When I got back to my room, my notebook was gone. Not moved. Gone. Someone had taken the dead from me. I stood alone with my hands empty and the echo of pages that no longer existed still whispering into my palms. It wasn't the notes that hurt. It was the theft of the only memorial the forgotten had been given. All night I sat in the dark, listening to my building breathe, wondering how long a man could remain himself when everything about him was subject to erasure. At dawn, I dressed in the same suit I might one day be buried in and went to places where men traded silence for survival. I did not beg. I did not threaten. I told stories. About Quinn Avery's voice. About Rose's letter. About a mother who had waited too long at a window that faced never. People listened not because I was persuasive, but because grief is contagious. By noon, someone slipped me a name like it was currency. Emil Harrow, Mercer's private accountant. A man who had learned where numbers came from and where they went when no one was watching. I found Harrow in an office that tried very hard to look respectable. Its windows overlooked the river with a view meant to distract. Its walls were decorated with art that did nothing except reassure the kind of people who liked reassurance. Harrow himself was a thin man trying to dress whiter than his guilt. "I won't say anything without my attorney," he said. "I'm not asking you to say anything," I replied. "I'm asking you to remember." His laugh was brittle. "That's worse. Which is why you should do it," I said. I told him what I knew without telling him I knew nothing. I spoke of refrigeration units ordered before bodies arrived, of permits signed in hands that did not touch, of places where trains stopped without stopping. Harrow's eyes slid away from mine, not as a man evading truth, but as one drowning and unwilling to look at water. "You don't want this," he whispered. "No one ever wants tuberculosis," I said. "They just wake up coughing." I let him speak only to fill the space. Silence is a form of confession if you leave it long enough. Finally, he collapsed into the chair behind him. "Mercer didn't choose them," he said. "Not at first. It started smaller. Cleaning, relocation, handling problems. Then people learned how easy it was to label other people as problems. After that, I prompted. Harrow shut his eyes. "After that, it became a supply chain." The word hit me harder than any threat had that night at the dock. Supply. As if lives moved in crates. As long as the city needed to feel orderly, Harrow went on, there would be men paid to make order appear. You can't build towers without clearing foundations. And who decided which bricks were expendable? I asked. Harrow's voice barely existed. People who never lived near the river. I stood. I did not thank him. I left that office knowing precisely how alone I was. By the time I reached the street, my face felt like a stranger's. I understood then that this was no longer about a killer in the dark. It had never been. This was architecture. When Burke found me that afternoon, his uniform was uncharacteristically wrinkled. "They've moved your file," he said. "It doesn't exist anymore in the main system. Your badge." He hesitated. "Your badge is scheduled for retirement." I nodded. It was overdue. Down at the river that night, I stood where my name had once been written. The chalk was gone, but the place remembered. And so did I. Cold rooms and warm hands. There are two kinds of cold. One lives in the air. It bites your skin, stiffens your fingers, teaches your breath to shiver. Cleveland wore that cold like a second coat most of the year. The other kind does not touch your body. It touches your memory. It is the cold of knowing how people disappear. After the notebook vanished, my hands felt useless. They hovered over empty pockets like they might still feel paper where there was none. There is a certain cruelty in theft that goes beyond property, the crime of removing proof that someone lived at all. I had lost more than notes. I had lost witnesses. That morning, when Burke handed me an envelope on the steps of the precinct, I knew before opening it that Cleveland had finally swallowed me whole. Inside was my retirement notice. No ceremony, no story. 4 dry paragraphs ending a life that had begun with idealism and died in paperwork. "You all right?" Burke asked. His voice was careful, too careful, like someone walking through glass. "They waited too long," I said. "I retired years ago. This just makes it official." It did not make me free. It made me hunted without a badge. Burke leaned close enough that his breath hit my cheek. "They're watching you," he said. "They always were. But now it's not from curiosity. It's from preparation." "For what?" I asked. He did not answer. Answers in this city were a dying profession. By noon I stood outside the new wing of the morgue Mercer had paid for. It loomed like a mausoleum pretending to be a laboratory. The brickwork was too clean. The windows too narrow. No one designed buildings like that unless they wanted nothing in to see out. I smoked a cigarette I did not finish and studied the door. A nurse I didn't recognize exited carrying a crate labeled medical equipment. Delicate. Her hands were steady in a way only men and women raised on secrets could manage. "Excuse me," I said. "Is Dr. Winslow in?" She did not look at my face. "He's between things," she replied. "So am I," said softly. She hesitated just long enough for me to see fatigue behind her calm. 5 minutes, she said. Not more. Dr. Winslow had eyes like someone who did not sleep well. He wore his lab coat like armor and his expressions like concessions. "Make it fast," he said. "I want to see the refrigeration units," I told him. He laughed without finding humor. "Do you walk into jewelry stores and demand the vault, too?" "No," I replied. "Only when the vault has a pulse." He studied me as though measuring whether my nonsense had mass. "You don't have clearance." "No," I admitted. "I have guilt." It tends to grant access where paper does not. Winslow looked past me, into the corridor, then back. 5 minutes, he repeated. After that, you never saw me. The unit hummed like a sleeping instrument. A cathedral for cold. Long rows of steel drawers set into walls that smelled faintly of antiseptic and surrender. This isn't standard municipal equipment, I said. Winslow shook his head. No, it's private. Precision engineered. Temperatures that don't waver. Who inspects it? I asked. His smile was tired. Who inspects the air? I opened one drawer. Inside lay not a body. Not today, but an imprint. An outline like absence had weight. Things were here, I said. Yes, Winslow whispered. And not all of them came with documentation. A man who works with the dead long enough begins to tell the truth to strangers. The living disappoint him too consistently. Why pay for this? I asked. Winslow's hands shook once. To preserve, he said. To control decay. To wait. For what? I asked. He did not answer. He closed the drawer and cleared his throat. Time's up. Outside, the city felt loud enough to bleed. That night, I dreamed of ice swallowing faces without leaving fingerprints. I woke gasping and sat on the edge of my bed, counting things that still existed. One chair, one window, one man who refused to disappear politely. The next lead came from a woman. They always do. She introduced herself as Margaret Hale, but she wore the name like a borrowed coat. Her real one was stitched somewhere deeper. We met in a church that had been converted into something not much like a church. Its pews had been rearranged to make room for soup pots and bodies weary enough to accept God in any shape. She told me her husband used to drive trucks for Mercer's freight branch. Used to? I asked. She shook her head. He was told to stop asking questions. Then he stopped coming home. What kind of questions? I said. She nervously twisted a handkerchief in her fingers. Schedule changes. Extra runs to warehouses that didn't appear on manifests. Routes that existed only on paper. He said once that he took a truck out full and brought it back empty, but no one asked where it had gone in between. I wrote nothing down. I listened. They paid him in cash, Margaret continued. Real money. He thought it meant promotion. What did it mean? I asked. She looked at the altar like it had once promised something. It meant silence, she said. When I asked for addresses, she supplied them with the precision of a woman who had rehearsed. A future she hoped never to need. The first warehouse was empty. The second smelled of oil and old wood. The third answered. Inside, among crates stamped with meaningless codes, I found a ledger burned at the edges. A last gasp object, survived by luck rather than design. There were numbers that did not match. Inventory that did not exist. Locations that did not connect. Cargo listed only as L. Load. Life. Lie. When I left the building, a man waited. He did not carry a weapon. He carried confidence. You don't belong here, he said. No one does, I replied. He smiled like a man with a prepared appetite. Then he hit me. I went down in Cleveland the hard way, face first into a city that never softened its welcome. The world narrowed to sound. Boots, breath, distant water laughing quietly. You should have stopped, he said. I tasted blood. Still time, he added. I laughed. It surprised us both. What's funny, he demanded. That, I said through split skin. You think time is what I'm running out of. He left me not dead. Teachings often end that way. In pieces. I dragged myself home with the ledger pressed against my ribs like a heart that wasn't mine. My room above the bar received me without judgment. Old places rarely do. I washed my face and stared at it until it agreed to be mine again. Then I sat. And I read. The ledger spoke in math. And math, when it lies, always tells the truth by accident. By morning, I knew enough to become a liability. By night, Cleveland would decide what to do with me. A city built on bones. Every city has a foundation. Some are poured. Some are planted. Cleveland was stacked. Layer upon layer of ambition, brick, sweat, and silence. And somewhere beneath it all, not in the dirt, but in the way decisions were made, lay the beds of its dead. The ledger did not read like a confession. It read like a business plan. Columns of shipments, coded by letters that replaced names. Dates aligned with nights when men were seen and not again. Routes that bent away from reason and returned empty. The more I read, the more the city's map rearranged itself into something grotesque and honest. Warehouses became mouths. Barges became hands. Trucks became spines. Mercer did not kill. He didn't have to. He engineered. And Cleveland complied. The L appeared again and again. It had no numerical value, no weight listed beside it. Just presence. Load. Not cargo. Content. Human content. I copied what I could onto scraps of paper torn from newspapers and empty cigarette boxes. My hands still shook from the beating, but clarity arrived with the steadiness of something that has been waiting quietly for recognition. Patterns cross-hatched. Gaps filled. Someone was selling absence. And it was profitable. When Burke arrived before dawn, I did not open the door right away. I waited for his knock to forget how careful it was trying to sound. "You look bad," he said when I let him in. "You should see the city," I replied. He did not smile. I showed him the ledger entries. He sat on the edge of my bed like a boy who had run out of road. "This isn't murder," he said. "No," I agreed. "It's infrastructure." He whistled through his teeth and leaned forward. "Can you prove it?" "Not in a courtroom," I said. "Maybe in hell." Burke rubbed his temples. "They'll bury this," he said. "They've been burying it," I countered. "All I've done is notice." He watched me the way men look at buildings scheduled for demolition. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "Step into the basement," I answered. That night, we split. Not from strategy, from instinct. Two men pretending this was still investigation and not trespass. Burke worked inside the system, a system with more holes than truth, while I stepped out of it entirely. I followed the trucks. Not in a car. On foot. Through streets that pretended I did not exist. It was easier that way. Invisible with intention. One of Mercer's trucks moved late. Not for deliveries, not for business. Midnight on the river does not require billing. It requires discretion. I trailed it from the flats to an abandoned section of dock machinery where ropes hung like dead veins and cranes hunched like old birds. The truck eased into a warehouse that breathed out darkness. I waited. A man exited through a side door and lit a cigarette with the air of someone who did not expect to die that evening. I did not kill him. I surprised him. That is more dangerous. He dropped the cigarette and went for something at his waist that did not save him. "What's in the truck?" I asked. His teeth chattered in weather that had nothing to do with cold. "Nothing," he said. "Then where did the nothing come from?" I asked. Silence. I leaned closer. "People disappear here," I said. "You're standing at the throat." He broke. Not dramatically. Efficiently. "Paper," he whispered. "Everything on paper. Shut mouths. Clean hands. I just move vehicles." "Where?" I demanded. "East Side Storage," he said. "Then the water." "Which water?" He stared at me as if I'd asked where dreams go to die. "The one that forgets," he said. I let him go. Not because he deserved mercy. Because fear would travel faster than his legs. Inside, the warehouse held only smell and memory. I did not go farther. Every man must choose where to stand when truth is standing naked. Mine was the night air outside those doors. The next day, Burke brought me what the system had been hiding behind clerical errors and tired faith. For identities. Nothing glamorous. No press. Just men who had complained too loudly at union meetings. A clerk who refused to falsify shipping numbers. A woman who had asked too many questions about the disappearance of her husband. A preacher who had used the wrong analogies too publicly. Not criminals. Disruptions. "You don't kill noise," Burke said. "You muffle it." "And if you can't?" I asked. "You remove the room," he replied. I felt it then, not dread. Understanding. Cleveland had not been overtaken by evil. It had subcontracted it. We spoke quietly that night, our voices the ghosts of something braver. "Maybe," Burke said, "we take it to the papers." "Which ones?" I asked. "The ones whose ink is purchased at the same store," he said. I nodded. When you live under power long enough, you come to understand the architecture of it. Route your truth the wrong way, and it is simply redirected. Or erased. 2 nights later, my building caught fire. It began politely. A smell. A whisper. Then heat like someone else's anger rushing through wood. I woke coughing with flames already arguing among the floorboards. I did not grab anything. I did not pack. I left with only the ledger and the little scraps of lives I had copied into places Mercer did not know to look. Down in the street, neighbors gathered like exhausted witnesses. The fire department did what it does best, arrived to catalog damage rather than prevent it. "Arson," they said. I stood in the ash with my coat still on and knew the city had moved a piece. Not on the board. Off it. When Burke found me, he did not ask if I was okay. He knew. I can't protect you anymore, he said. You never did, I replied gently. You just helped me pretend. He swallowed. Then do something that matters, he urged. I intended to, I said. I went to one last warehouse. The one east of everything. The one the ledger implied but did not describe. At its door, I found only darkness. And inside, not murder, not violence. Silence stacked like inventory. Dozens of small things that once belonged to larger lives. A city's worth of proof, archived where humanity would never wander accidentally. I understood then that Cleveland was not built on hope. It was built on rearranged bodies. And I stood in its blueprint. Where the light doesn't reach. The warehouse did not feel abandoned. It felt retired, like something that had done its work long enough to be left alone with its secrets. The air inside had layers, each one older than the last, all of them unmoving. Dust does not simply settle in places like this. It organizes. I did not move at first. The echo of my own breath felt like an intrusion. You don't break into a place like that. You trespass on something that believes it owns time. The items inside weren't arranged with care. They were arranged with indifference. Crates of shoes with no matching pairs. Coats patched and repatched, not out of fashion but necessity. Rings beaten thin from wear. Watches that had stopped at different hours, but all on days that would never be revisited. Lives reduced to logistics. I stepped between them as if the dead were sleeping in the aisles, and I might wake them if I walked too loudly. Rows and rows of belongings stood as testimony where bodies were never meant to lie. This wasn't a dumping ground. It was a library of the erased. Near the back wall, behind a false partition dressed up as decay, I found the records. Shellac discs, audio. Metal cabinets scarred with coated ink. Notations written by hands that had probably shaken the first few times and then grown comfortably precise. I loaded one of the discs onto a player that had survived war and neglect better than most men survive mornings. At first, there was nothing. Then a voice. Not commanding. Cooperative. Subject number 32. Male. Age approximately 50. Union involvement confirmed. Non-compliant with negotiation outcome. Emotional attachments unknown. The voice did not list wounds. It listed usefulness. Whether a man screamed was irrelevant. Whether he stopped being useful, that was the punctuation. Further back, ledgers layered into each other like lies written over older truths. Names were used early in the collection, not later. Once efficiency arrived, so did anonymity. The system did not fail. It perfected. I do not remember how many records I listened to. I remember only the moment my hand stopped shaking and something else took over. Anger is useful at first. Then it becomes heavy. Finally, it becomes arithmetic. I gathered documents, discs, anything that would burn brighter in the world outside than it ever had inside these walls. And then I heard breathing. Not the guarded inhalation of a man trying not to be found. The tired breathing of someone who had given up trying. I moved toward it slowly and found a girl. Not young, just small. Wrapped in 3 coats she did not own. Are you real? She asked. I did not trust my voice. Yes, I said. She studied me without fear. That is how I knew fear had already finished its work inside her. They bring people here, she whispered. I know, I said. They don't come back, she said. I know. They make noise, but it's not screaming, she added. I crouched down in front of her. Will you come with me? I asked. She shook her head. I hide, she said. I've always been good at it. I swallowed. There's more outside than this, I said. She considered the lie. Then she nodded, but not in agreement. In understanding. It's quieter here, she said. I left her a lantern. A small one. I told myself it mattered. When I returned to the street, the city roared like it had done nothing wrong. I walked until my feet didn't remember my name. Then I went to the underground. Not tunnels. Rumors. Men who had learned that silence could be shattered if struck from the right angle with the wrong truth. I went to dock workers who were no longer getting paid. Journalists who were no longer getting assignments. Clerks who had been promoted into forgetfulness. I spoke. Quietly at first. Then less so. Truth does not like to be whispered for long. Every time I told it, it became louder. Every time someone believed it, it became less mine. Burke did not come anymore, which meant I didn't have to worry about bringing fire to the wrong door. Then one night, he did. Mercer is running, he said. I believed him. Good, I replied. Let him learn geography. He's disappearing, Burke corrected. I sighed. Of course he is. We stood in the gutter and pretended this was still friendship. You have to get out, he said. I thought I already did, I answered. You've been seen, he said. Too many times. Finally, I said. He grabbed my arm. They're not just watching you. I hope not, I whispered. I did not tell him about the girl. Some things are too fragile to become real out loud. We separated with the guilt of men who would not share coffins. I went back to the warehouse to retrieve more. It was burning. Not the accidental kind. The deliberate kind. The kind that uses purpose as kindling. Flames ate history in gulps. Paper screams when it dies. So do recordings. I tried to enter. Smoke decided otherwise. I watched my proof turn into ghosts. I did not cry. Cleveland had done enough of that already. I reached into my coat and touched what I still had. Not much. Enough. The next morning, leaflets appeared. On lampposts. On doors. In bread lines. Typed. Anonymous. Accusatory. I had become a rumor with teeth. The city answered me with silence. Too organized. Too thorough. That is when I knew I had touched something real. Then the river gave up a body. No head. No name. Just hands still tied with rope that carried the same knots I'd seen in Mercer's warehouse. They called it coincidence. I called it prevention. A city does not respond to accusation with words. It responds with example. The price of remembering. The thing about memory is that it does not belong to the past. It lives in the present and demands rent. Some people pay it with photographs. Others with bourbon. Cleveland paid it with men like me. Men who couldn't forget well enough to survive. After the body surfaced, the river became a confession line. Not because it spoke, but because it had finally been heard. Something about a corpse makes whispers bolder. People who had been quiet for years suddenly remembered things. Sounds. Smells. Routes. A logbook that had gone missing. A truck that came too often and stayed too long. Memory stopped being a burden and became a weapon. And weapons always find hands. The leaflets multiplied. They grew legs. Every morning brought a new lie rumor with my fingerprints on it. Every evening brought a new truth that someone had decided no longer belonged to them. Someone had published a name. Not Mercer's. Mine. It appeared on a dock wall in black paint that ran like it had cried its way across brick. Elias Kerr. The city did not ask who I was. It decided. And decisions are always louder than introductions. I became a sympathy case for some. A traitor for others. A myth with a cough and bad posture. I was no longer useful. Which made me dangerous. Burke arrived unannounced and unshaven. There was ash on his coat, like a second badge. They know it's you, he said. I assumed, I replied. You're not careful, he said. I'm tired, I countered. He paced like a man circling a bad idea. They offered me promotion, he said. I did not speak. I said no, he added. Now I did. Good, I said. He exhaled heavily. It would have meant your name never came up again, he admitted. Or came up everywhere, I said. He nodded. They want it contained. They always do, I said. But you're not a scandal, he argued. You're infection. I laughed without sound. That's new. They're scared, he continued. I've never seen them scared. Then they hear, I said. Finally, I did not tell him I was hunted. Some things work better when unsaid. That night, the city exhaled a warrant. Not printed. Felt. I kept moving. Apartment to hallway. Basement to street. Train cars judged me and let me pass. The girl appeared in my dreams. Always looking at me. Never accusing. Somehow worse. The underground hardened. Journalists started printing my leaflets between recipes and birth announcements. Dockworkers rerouted cargo out of spite. Not heroism. Spite. In Cleveland, that passed for revelation. Someone leaked a payroll. It spoke names I had never heard spoken aloud. And suddenly, everything became fragile. Buildings. Reputations. The idea of tomorrow. When power loses shape, it panics. When it panics, it crushes. Burke found me in a church that had given up on prayer and specialized in dust. They're burning every record, he said. That's ineffective, I answered. Why? Records don't die, I said. They become people. He stared at me. People talk, I continued. Buildings don't. They'll kill you, he said. They'll try, I corrected. And then they'll fail, I said. You sound certain. I'm already dead, I replied. Free men always are. We walked the city like ghosts with errands. I told him about the discs, the items, the library of the erased. He went quiet. I thought it was all metaphor, he said. It's all inventory, I answered. He wanted to get me out. I wanted to get something in. One last message. Not anonymous. Earned. We planned it in the language of men who know the end arrives either way. The rally picked itself. Angry men do not need invitations. They only need permission. Someone left a microphone unattended. I borrowed it. I spoke. Not my name. My crime. I have walked where you were told nothing happened, I said. And I brought back what you were told never existed. No poetry. No pity. Just facts. Factories that weren't factories. Accounting that smelled like rot. Faces typed into numbers. Cleveland did not scream. It inhaled. And inhalation is always followed by something violent. I did not see the man who stepped through the crowd. I felt him. Pain is not loud. It is personal. The knife did not negotiate. And neither did my body. Burke caught me. He swore. He pressed his hands against something that was no longer interested in medicine. The world narrowed into a tunnel that was tired of my footsteps. I smiled at him. It surprised us both. They'll remember now, I said. He cried. Not quietly. Good. The city should hear something honest for once. What the river kept. People think death is loud. It isn't. It's quiet. Like the moment after a question you were afraid to ask is finally answered. The night I died, Cleveland didn't stop breathing. It did not pause its trains. It did not mourn any particular man. Cities don't recognize residents. They recognize absence. Burke never told me later what my face looked like in his hands. That kindness was his. What I remember is simpler. The sound of shoes on pavement, not running. Walking quickly. The kind of walking that pretends it has no destination. I remember the ceiling of the ambulance. Yellowed like the last pages of a book you know you will not finish. And then there was no ceiling. Only water. Not drowning. Floating. The river welcomed me the way old enemies welcome each other when they're too tired to continue. Without ceremony. Without apology. I did not fight it. I had done enough of that. I do not know how long I was gone. But absence has no clocks. When I returned, it was not to a hospital bed. It was to public memory. My name appeared again. Not in paint. In print. Not in accusation. In obituary. Small. Incorrect. The birth year wrong. The job mislabeled. The life mistaken. Even in death, Cleveland made clerical errors. Burke argued with the paper until his voice became a ghost. It refused correction. Truth costs money. Error comes free. And people prefer bargains. The city held its breath, expecting something else to die with me. It did not. The leaflets turned into pamphlets. The pamphlets into columns. The columns into resignations. Men who had mistaken longevity for innocence began leaving quietly in the night. Some never explained. Some never arrived at their next destination. Only the river remembered all of it. Burke stayed. He did not retire. He did not promote. He did something more dangerous. He worked. Not loudly. Correctly. Every file he touched stopped being polite. It began being honest. Every favor he declined became a door that closed to someone who depended on darkness to walk. He never said my name out loud again. But he spoke it in every refusal. Cleveland changed. Not quickly. Real change is never dramatic. It is procedural. One signature refusing to bend. One shipment refusing silence. One woman refusing default. Not revolution. Correction. The girl in the warehouse moved. Someone found her at a soup kitchen months later, eating like the future owed her nutrients. She still did not talk much, but she owned her silence differently now. Like clothing. The river never returned my body. Not fully. Just a shoe. The left one. As if to suggest, even water gets tired of carrying the wrong weight. They buried it. A symbolic thing requires symbolism to survive. Burke attended. He stood far back. Men like him don't stand near conclusions. They stand near exits. I watched. I do not know from where. I only know I was watching. And that is how I learned the city had changed. Not because it apologized. Because it flinched when it almost forgot again. There were plaques. Small. Uncomfortable. They did not mention my name. They mentioned incidents. That is how cities deal with ghosts. They summarize. Down by the river, where the water bends in a way that looks almost like thinking, they built nothing. No monument. No bench. No sign. Just left it alone. And that, in Cleveland, was new behavior. Memory is not a place. It's a decision. The ledger I carried disappeared. Or reappeared. Those things look the same if you're not holding them. But pieces of it, facts, dates, shame, began surfacing like fish who had finally learned how to scream. Not in one man's voice. In hundreds. Not with poetry. with proof. They did not call it justice. That would have required humility. They called it modernization, reform, restructuring. Cities prefer language that moves forward, even when the forward motion is just sideways guilt. Burke aged quickly. That happens when you outlive lies. But he smiled at shopkeepers, at children, at women who had not yet learned how easily men are taught. He kept walking the river, not to remember, to verify. And Cleveland learned that forgetting is expensive, eventually. And I learned that nothing is ever buried deep enough to escape long enough. That silence is not empty. That water is a witness. That cities build themselves on bones and then insist the ground is holy. I did not save Cleveland. I did not redeem the dead. I did not dismantle the machine. I only interrupted it, just long enough to teach it that it could bleed. And machines that bleed are never trusted again. The river did not keep me. It returned me everywhere else. In pamphlets, in questions, in quiet men who stopped signing their names to ugly things. People think death in stories. It doesn't. It distributes them. Across streets. Across years. Across choices. And sometimes, into a city that finally notices it is standing on its own reflection.